On this Labor Day, the battle over workers' freedoms are at a crossroads. Though union officials and their allies in government use this day to claim to speak for America's workers, they are simultaneously hard at work trying to undermine the individual liberty of those same American workers. The last decade saw record advances for workers' right to free association, with 5 new states enacting right-to-work protections which defend a worker from being fired merely for a refusal to pay dues to a labor union he or she does not support. 27 states now protect this basic fundamental freedom, and as of last year, a majority of America's working men and women now work in right-to-work states. That's on top of the National Right to Work Foundation won 2018 Janice v. AFSCME Supreme Court victory, which recognized the First Amendment right of every public worker to choose for him or herself whether or not to fund a labor union. Unfortunately, rather than embrace voluntarism and worker choice, union officials have instead doubled down on coercion. Their top priority in Congress, the so-called PRO Act, would add tens of millions of workers to the union bosses' pay up or be fired ranks by wiping out all state right-to-work laws by federal fiat. Meanwhile, despite the Janus ruling, government union bosses have continued to undermine and outright ignore the First Amendment right of public employees to cease all funding of the political activities of all government unions. This has resulted in dozens of Janus enforcement lawsuits nationwide, including 2 foundation cases currently pending at the United States Supreme Court. Yet big labor's push for more power to impose their so-called representation and mandatory dues payments on workers remains at odds with the overwhelming majority of Americans. Polls show Americans still overwhelmingly oppose forced unionism, consistently finding that around 80% of Americans agree with the right-to-work principle that union membership and dues payment should be voluntary, not coerced. On this Labor Day, as hard-working rank-and-file workers continue to grapple with economic uncertainty and lingering COVID disruptions, it is more important now than ever that we reject big labor's scheme to expand forced unionism over more workers and instead respect the individual freedom to decide whether or not a union deserves their support.
Amid the Labor Day holiday, the Right to Work Foundation is sounding the alarm over Biden's proposal to change labor laws. One America's John Hines has that report.
The National Right to Work Foundation is a grassroots lobbying organization standing for the idea that all Americans must have the right to join a union if they so choose, but that no one should ever be forced to affiliate with a union to get or keep a job. And with us is Mark Mix, the president of the National Right to Work Foundation. And Mr. Mix, I believe that Jennifer Abruzzo is the new attorney for the National Labor Relations Board, and she has put out a memo in which she has outlined a plan to roll back the clock in what has been called the most dramatic changes to labor law in the last 40 years with this Biden administration. What seems to be going on, Mark Mix?
Well, it's a big story, and there's lots of big stories in the news today, but there's always this constant drumbeat of compulsion that comes out of the National Labor Relations Board. This is the 5-member board that was created back in the 1930s to basically adjudicate labor policy when the federal government decided to take over labor policy for the entire nation. They created a 3-member board, and of course everything in Washington grows, so it went from 3 to 5 members. And Jennifer Abruzzo is the general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board. 23 minutes into the Biden administration, as the echoes of Garth Brooks' Amazing Grace were coming back to the podium, Biden requested that the general counsel, the general counsel that had 11 months left on their term, be fired. Either that or resign. The general counsel said, this is an independent agency, we shouldn't resign. You're tampering with something that's never been done before in the history of the NLRB. But Biden said either resign or be fired by 5 o'clock. And the general counsel said, I'm not going to resign, so he was fired at 5 o'clock. The next day, the acting general counsel, who moved up one step, was given the same email saying resign or be fired. And at 5 o'clock that day, the day after the inauguration, that general counsel was fired. And so the president has put in an activist, Jennifer Abruzzo, who was a former general counsel.
She's replacing these people, is that right?
She's the new general counsel. She's the former attorney, lead attorney for the Communication Workers of America, which is a very large union. And she now is in charge of the litigation process at the National Labor Relations Board. And John, you correctly identified, she put out a memo saying that she wanted to change things, and it really affects the National Right to Work Foundation because several of the issues that she is raising, saying she no longer wants anyone to deal with except her here in Washington, are issues that our Legal Defense Foundation is representing.
Now, she's changing the way, or the rules, I guess, with regard to whether or not you need to vote to join a union or whether or not you need to just simply check off a card. What's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. Card check is one of the highest priorities of organized labor because they can't win elections. They're not winning elections when actually people get behind a curtain and get to vote by secret ballot and say, yeah, yes or no for unions. I mean, we do that for everything else. Well, I mean, notwithstanding the last year and a half, we do it for most important offices. We vote by secret ballot. But they don't like that. So they're going to try to impose this card check regime where you basically say, if I can convince you, John, or if I and two of my big neck friends can convince you to sign a card that says you're interested in the union, that counts as a vote for unionization. In fact, we have
now that's different than the current practice, though, right? Isn't it?
It would be, yes. The secret ballot election is the preferred and actually statutorily and from a precedential standpoint, the way that you select representation in the workplace.
And Ms. Abruzzo has said that they will recognize the card check method of determining whether or not somebody joins a union or whether or not they unionize a business. Is that right?
That's correct. They believe that no matter what happens and how those cards were obtained, they're going to basically see that as majority status.
Why should anybody be worried about that? Why should anybody care whether or not people, whether it's easier to unionize a business or more difficult?
Well, because most of the time, even the AFL-CIO admitted in an organizing handbook that you've got to get 75% of all the workers in a unit to sign these cards to have any chance of winning a secret ballot election. Because they know that many workers will simply sign the card to get you off their back. When you show up at their front porch at 10 o'clock at night with three of your friends and say, hey, are you interested in higher pay, or are you interested in health insurance, or just sign the card, that coercion, that intimidation that's implicit in that type of organizing campaigns basically defeats the whole purpose of the secret ballot. And if they can get those cards as the mechanism for certifying unions, then the intimidation and coercion will only expand over workers.
On the eve of Labor Day, Mark Mix with the National Right to Work Foundation. Thank you for talking to us on One American News, sir. Good to catch up with you.
It's a privilege, John. Thanks for the opportunity.